So here we have a PowerPoint presentation on identifying the elements of a plot diagram. Here and today we're going to take guided notes on how to successfully understand the elements of plot. So what we have here on the screen is our little hiker, and this is a typical diagram that you'll see for the elements of plot. There are 5 points of reference that we're going to look at today that typically help us transition through things such as short stories or movies, for instance. So looking at line number 1, where we have our little guy, I'm going to go through each of the points and then we'll look at them a little bit more in depth further into the PowerPoint. But line number 1, as our hiker has just hiked, is the exposition. Line number 2 is the rising action. Line number 3 is the climax. The descend to line 4 is the falling action. And then line number 5 takes us out to the resolution. Looking here at the next slide, the plot, given the definition, is the organized pattern or sequence of events that make up a story. Every plot is made up of a series of incidents that are related to one another. For example, the plot of the 3 Little Pigs, from the wolf's point of view, was to get inside of the wolf's homes. So plot is always the sequence of events in which they happen. Let's look at it a little bit more. So these events usually occur in short stories, and in the beginning, as I mentioned earlier, is the exposition. The exposition is where the characters are introduced, and we also learn about the setting and things that are important for the conflict that will develop eventually. So if we look at the story of, let's say, Little Red Riding Hood. In the beginning, we understand that Little Red Riding Hood is a young girl who is trying to get to her mother's house. So that's her first, is introducing the main conflict, and it gives us the setting, which is in the woods, as she sets out to grandmother's house. Unfortunately, as she gets here to the rising action, this is where the conflict starts to develop. This part of the story begins to develop the conflict. A building of interest or suspense occurs. So, once Little Red Riding Hood gets into mother's house or grandmother's house, the suspense starts to build for us. One of the things that changes the story is the climax, and this here is the turning point. Usually the main character comes face to face with the conflict. In Little Red Riding's case, her conflict was the wolf, who hid grandmother in some instances. So how does Little Red try to solve the problem? That's what we find out during the falling action. All loose ends of the plot are tied up. Hence, after she finds out the wolf was in grandmother's bed, she tries to cut his tail off in some of the stories that we've read. Nonetheless, this is when the character starts to change, physically, mentally, emotionally. Just change in the plot kind of begins to come to an end as the loose ends are tied up. The resolution of the story is obviously the happily ever after. This is how the story comes to a reasonable end. In putting it all together, the exposition and the rising action typically begin the story. The climax is the middle, whereby it's the turning point and the most exciting part. It's exciting to read when Little Red Riding Hood has to confront the wolf that is in grandmother's bed. The falling action and the resolution are the ending of the story. It gives us, the reader, a conclusion on how the story and solution to how the character